They thought it would be a joke the moment her name appeared on the screen, but no one in that theater had any idea they were seconds away from witnessing something they would never forget as the golden lights of the downtown auditorium reflected off polished wood floors and designer heels clicked across the stage. Influencers and performers whispering behind perfect smiles, waiting for their turn in front of judges who had seen it all, or at least believed they had, until a quiet figure sat alone in the back row, almost invisible, her gray cardigan soft and worn, her silver hair neatly tied back, hands folded calmly in her lap, as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. Evelyn Carter had signed her name without drawing attention, but attention found her anyway the moment a production assistant leaned down and asked, with a polite but dismissive smile, "Ma'am, are you here to watch, or did you sign up by mistake?" And a few nearby contestants chuckled under their breath. Not cruel enough to be called out, just enough to remind her she didn't belong in a place where success was measured in followers and flash rather than substance. On stage, the host adjusted his jacket, scanning the list with a raised eyebrow when he reached her name, pausing just long enough for the audience to feel it. "Next up, Evelyn Carter," he said, stretching the name slightly, as if unsure whether it was real, and a ripple of quiet amusement spread across the crowd. A few people lifting their phones, already anticipating something awkward, something forgettable, something easy to laugh at, because in a room built on spectacle, simplicity looked like weakness, and Evelyn looked simple. She rose without hesitation, her movements slow but deliberate, each step toward the stage echoing softly against the hardwood as conversations faded not out of respect, but curiosity, the kind reserved for moments people expect to go wrong. One judge leaned toward another, whispering just loud enough to be heard, "Let's keep this one quick," while another flipped through his notes, uninterested before she even reached the microphone. But Evelyn didn't react, her eyes steady, her posture composed, as if the room, the lights, the judgment, none of it held any weight against something far deeper inside her, something quiet, but unshakable. And as she stepped into the center of the spotlight, the glow outlining her figure against a backdrop designed for stars, she gently adjusted the microphone with hands that no longer trembled, and for a brief moment, a strange stillness settled over the room, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the air itself was waiting, and though no one could explain why, a few in the audience leaned forward, sensing something shift before a single note had even been played, as if the stage, for the first time that night, had finally found someone who didn't need it to shine. The silence stretched just a second longer than anyone expected, long enough for a few smiles to fade and a few brows to tighten, because something about the way Evelyn Carter stood there did not match the joke they had already decided she was. And then she closed her eyes, not dramatically, not for effect, but like someone returning to a place that had been waiting for her. And when she opened them again, there was a steadiness that did not belong to uncertainty. It belonged to memory, to mastery, to something practiced far beyond this stage. And without a word, without an introduction, she began, the first note leaving her lips with a depth that did not just fill the room, but seemed to settle into it, rich and controlled, the kind of sound that made conversations impossible and forced attention without asking for it. The judge who had leaned back moments ago straightened slowly, his pen stopping midair, while another blinked as if recalibrating what he thought he was hearing. Because this was not beginner talent. This was not even amateur excellence. This was something refined, something lived in, something that carried weight. And as the melody unfolded, it did not rush, it did not try to impress. It simply existed with a quiet authority that demanded respect. The audience shifted in their seats, phones lowering, laughter dissolving into a stillness that felt almost fragile, like any noise might break whatever was happening on that stage. And Evelyn did not look at them. She did not look at the judges. She remained focused somewhere beyond the room, as if the performance was not for approval but for truth, each note placed with precision, each pause intentional, creating a rhythm that pulled the room deeper into her world. And then it began to build, not louder, but fuller. Layers of control revealing themselves in subtle ways, breath support, phrasing, the kind of technique that only years could carve into a person. And one of the judges leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. That control, that phrasing. And another responded, just as quietly. This is not her first stage. And somewhere in the audience, a man who had been recording slowly lowered his phone, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief, because what they were witnessing did not align with the story they had already written about her. And that was when the room truly changed, not with applause, not yet, but with understanding, a collective realization spreading silently that they had misjudged something far greater than they could have imagined. And yet Evelyn remained untouched by it, her voice steady, her presence grounded, as if she had already lived this moment before, perhaps many times, in places far grander than this. And the question began to move through the room without words. Who is she? Who have we just invited onto this stage? And why does it feel like we are the ones being tested? By the time Evelyn Carter reached the midpoint of her performance, the room no longer belonged to the judges, the producers, or the carefully curated image of the show. It belonged entirely to her, and everyone could feel it, the subtle authority in her presence growing with every note. Not forced, not dramatic, just undeniable, like a truth that had been quietly waiting to be heard. And somewhere in the second row, a woman who had been whispering earlier now sat completely still, her hand slowly lowering from her phone as her eyes locked onto the stage, because what she was witnessing did not feel like entertainment anymore. It felt like something personal, something rare, and on stage Evelyn shifted seamlessly into a higher register. The transition so smooth, it almost went unnoticed until it lingered in the air, resonating with a clarity that made one of the judges inhale sharply, his expression tightening as recognition began to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle his confidence. And beside him another judge leaned closer, his voice barely audible. That technique, that control, this is trained, deeply trained. And the first judge nodded slowly, eyes narrowing, as if searching through memories he could not quite reach, because performers like this did not just appear, they came from somewhere, from years, from stages that left marks on those who witnessed them. And as Evelyn continued, her phrasing became more intricate, more deliberate, each pause carrying weight, each note placed with intention, the kind of precision that did not just showcase skill but revealed experience, the kind that could not be taught in a few lessons or captured in a viral moment, and the audience felt it. Even those who did not understand technique felt the shift. The way the room had grown quieter, heavier, more attentive, as if everyone instinctively knew they were part of something they had not expected. And then came a subtle change, a single phrase delivered with a depth that carried emotion far beyond the melody itself. And it was in that moment that a man near the back straightened abruptly, his eyes widening as he leaned toward the person beside him, whispering urgently, "No, that cannot be." And yet he did not look away, because the more he listened, the more certain he became. While on stage, Evelyn remained composed, her expression calm, almost distant, as if the reactions around her existed in another world, separate from the one she was inhabiting, and the judges could no longer pretend indifference. One of them setting his pen down completely, hands now folded as he watched with full attention, his earlier dismissal replaced by something closer to respect, or perhaps disbelief. And then, as the final section approached, the performance did not explode into something loud or overwhelming. Instead it deepened, pulling inward, drawing every listener closer, forcing them to lean in, to focus, to feel every subtle shift. And in that narrowing of sound, in that controlled restraint, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a newcomer. This was not a lucky moment. This was someone who had once stood on stages far beyond this one. Someone who had been here before. And as the final note began to rise, carried with quiet power, one of the judges finally whispered the thought none of them could hold back any longer. "We are not judging her. We are witnessing her." The final note did not crash into the room. It arrived with precision, rising just enough to fill every corner of the theater before settling into a silence so complete it felt almost unreal, as if the entire audience had forgotten how to breathe at the same time. And for a brief second, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even shifted in their seat, because what had just happened did not match anything they had prepared themselves to react to. And on stage, Evelyn Carter lowered her gaze slightly, her hand releasing the microphone with the same calm control she had shown from the very beginning. No flourish, no demand for applause, no attempt to hold the moment. She simply let it exist, and that was when the spell broke. A single clap echoed from somewhere near the front, hesitant at first, uncertain, but it did not remain alone for long, because recognition spreads quickly when truth becomes undeniable, and within seconds the entire room rose to its feet, the sound of applause building not in chaos but in waves, steady, overwhelming, and filled with something deeper than excitement, something closer to respect. And the judges who had once dismissed her now stood as well, there. Expressions no longer guarded, no longer skeptical, but openly stunned. One of them shaking his head slowly as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with the assumptions he had made only minutes before, while another leaned toward his colleague and spoke with quiet urgency. "It is her. It has to be." And the name passed between them like a realization they could no longer contain. Evelyn Carter. A name that had once filled concert halls, a voice that had once defined an era before, disappearing without explanation, and now here she was, standing in front of them in a simple cardigan as if none of it had ever mattered, and yet everything about her proved that it had, because mastery does not disappear, it waits, and the audience could feel it. Even those who did not know her history understood instinctively that they had just witnessed something rare, something that could not be recreated or staged. And yet Evelyn did not acknowledge the applause beyond a small nod, her expression unchanged, her eyes calm, as if she had not come here to reclaim anything or to prove anyone wrong, but simply to be present in a moment that did not belong to judgment or validation. And as the applause continued, louder, longer, almost desperate to hold her there, she took a single step back from the spotlight, then another, her figure gradually leaving the center of the stage as quietly as she had entered it. And for the first time that night, the room understood something they had not expected to learn, that true greatness does not chase attention. It leaves an impression so powerful that silence becomes the only honest response. And as Evelyn Carter disappeared beyond the curtain, one question lingered in every mind. Not who she was, but why someone like her had ever needed a stage like this at all. Backstage, the noise from the standing ovation still echoed faintly through the walls, but the moment Evelyn Carter stepped beyond the curtain, it faded into something distant, almost irrelevant, like applause meant for someone else, and she moved through the narrow hallway with the same quiet composure she had carried onto the stage, her footsteps soft against the concrete floor, her expression unchanged, as if what had just happened required no reaction at all. And yet behind her, everything was unraveling in a different way. Producers whispering urgently, staff checking schedules, judges rising from their seats earlier than planned, because something unexpected had disrupted not just the show, but the narrative they thought they controlled. And one of the judges, the one who had first leaned back in dismissal, now pushed through the backstage door with a sense of urgency he could no longer hide, his voice low but insistent as he spoke to a producer. "Find her now." Because recognition had settled fully into his mind, not as a possibility, but as certainty, and it carried with it a weight that could not be ignored. While in the hallway, Evelyn paused briefly near a side exit, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, as if considering something. Not hesitation, but reflection, the kind that comes after returning to a place long left behind. And for a moment, the sounds of the past seemed to brush against her memory, distant applause, brighter stages, names spoken with admiration instead of curiosity. But she did not linger there, she never had. And as the door opened slightly, a cool evening breeze slipped inside, carrying with it the quiet of a world that did not demand anything from her. And just as she stepped forward, a voice called out from behind, "Evelyn," firm, almost disbelieving, and she stopped, not startled, not rushed, simply still. As the judge approached, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more human, uncertainty, respect, and perhaps a hint of regret. "It really is you," he said, his voice softer now, careful, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever truth he had just uncovered. And Evelyn turned slightly, her gaze meeting his without challenge, without pride, just acknowledgement. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some realizations do not need words. They simply exist between people. Undeniable. And finally he continued, "You disappeared. The entire industry wondered what happened. his tone no longer that of a judge, but of someone trying to understand something beyond his reach. And Evelyn listened, her expression calm. Before offering the smallest of responses, "I did not disappear," she said gently, her voice carrying the same quiet strength as her performance. "I just stopped performing for people who were not really listening." And the words settled between them with a clarity that left no room for argument, because out on that stage, in a room full of noise and expectation, she had just proven exactly what she meant. And as she turned back toward the exit, leaving behind the man who now understood far more than he had minutes before, one truth remained undeniable. Respect is not something you ask for. It is something you reveal, and once revealed, it changes everything. The door closed softly behind Evelyn Carter as she stepped out into the cool evening air, the noise of the theater fading into a distant echo that no longer belonged to her. And for a moment she stood there beneath the dim glow of a streetlight, the city moving around her without recognition, without expectation, just the quiet rhythm of life continuing as it always had. Cars passing, footsteps on pavement, conversations drifting through the air, and yet inside that building behind her, everything had shifted. Conversations no longer casual but urgent, names being repeated with disbelief, producers scrambling to confirm what some of them were only beginning to understand. Because the woman who had just walked out so calmly was not simply a contestant. She was a history they had overlooked, and back inside, the judge who had followed her to the hallway remained standing where she had left him, his mind replaying every second of her performance, every assumption he had made, every moment he had dismissed her before she even began. And now those moments felt heavier, sharper, because they revealed something uncomfortable, not about her, but about him. And across the stage the host attempted to regain control of the show, his voice louder than necessary, his smile forced, as if trying to restore the illusion that everything was proceeding as planned. But the audience was different now, quieter, more aware, their attention no longer easily directed, because once people witness something real, something undeniable, it becomes impossible to return to something artificial. And in the front row a woman turned to her friend and whispered, "How did we not see it?" And the question lingered because it had no simple answer, not about talent, not about age, not about appearance, but about perception, about how quickly people decide what someone is worth before they ever give them the chance to show it. And outside, Evelyn began to walk, her pace steady, unhurried, her figure blending into the ordinary world as if that was always where she belonged. And perhaps it was, because for her, the stage had never been about validation. It had never been about proving anything to anyone. It had been about something far simpler and far more rare, expression without expectation, truth without performance. And as she reached the corner and paused briefly, the faint sound of applause still carried through the night air, softer now, almost like a memory. And she did not turn back, not because she rejected it, but because she no longer needed it. And behind her, inside that brightly lit theater, a realization continued to spread, quiet but irreversible, that greatness does not disappear with time. It simply waits for the moment when it no longer needs to be seen to be understood. And on that night, in a room full of people who thought they came to judge, they had been reminded of something far more important. That respect is not given to those who demand attention, it is revealed by those who never needed it in the first place. The city lights stretched ahead of Evelyn Carter as she continued down the quiet sidewalk, each step carrying her farther from the noise, from the expectations, from the sudden wave of recognition that had tried to follow her out of that building. And yet something subtle had already changed, not in her pace, not in her posture, but in the air around her, because moments like that do not stay contained. They ripple, they travel, they linger in conversations long after the sound fades. And inside the theater, those ripples were growing, spreading from seat to seat, from whispered conversation to full realization, as phones lit up with quick searches, old videos resurfacing, archive performances appearing on screens with titles that once defined an era. And one by one, people began to connect what they had just witnessed with something far greater than a talent show. While backstage the tension had shifted into urgency, producers speaking in hushed but rapid tones. "Do we have confirmation? Is it really her?" As if saying her name too loudly might make it disappear again. and the judge who had spoken to her stood apart now, watching it unfold with a quiet understanding that this was no longer about the show. It was about something they had all nearly missed, and on stage the host struggled to regain rhythm, introducing the next act with energy that felt slightly forced, because even he knew the room was different now. The audience no longer reacting the same way, their attention deeper, more selective, as if they had been reminded that not everything worth seeing comes wrapped in spectacle. And in the third row, a young performer who had been preparing for his own turn stared at his hands. His earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, because what he had just seen was not just talent. It was truth. And truth has a way of reshaping how people see themselves. And outside, Evelyn paused briefly at a crosswalk, the signal glowing red as cars passed in steady lines, her reflection faint in a storefront window beside her. And for a moment she looked at it, not with nostalgia, not with regret, but with calm recognition, the same person she had always been, unchanged by applause, untouched by judgment. And the light shifted, green now, and she stepped forward without hesitation, blending once again into the rhythm of a world that did not stop for moments like the one she had just created. And yet somewhere behind her, in that theater filled with people who had come expecting to judge, something continued to settle, a quiet understanding that they had not just watched a performance, they had witnessed a reminder that greatness does not announce itself, it reveals itself, often in the moments when no one is prepared to see it, and once seen, it changes the way everything else is measured. The ripple did not stop at the theater doors, it followed people into the night, into rides home, into quiet kitchens and late conversations, because moments like that refused to stay contained. And inside the building the aftermath had turned into something almost reverent, the kind of energy that does not fade quickly, as staff replayed recordings on monitors, pausing, rewinding, watching again as if trying to understand what they had missed the first time, while one producer leaned back slowly and said under his breath, "We almost cut her segment short," and no one responded, because the weight of that realization was enough. And across the stage the remaining contestants stood differently now, their confidence quieter, their focus sharper, because what they had witnessed had reset the standard without saying a word. And in the audience a middle-aged man scrolled through his phone, stopping at a grainy video from decades earlier, a younger Evelyn Carter standing beneath brighter lights, receiving a standing ovation that looked strikingly similar to the one she had just left behind. And he turned the screen to the person beside him, whispering, "It is her. She was everywhere back then." And the response came slowly, almost in disbelief. Then why did she leave? And that question lingered, because it was not just curiosity anymore. It was reflection, and outside, several blocks away, Evelyn turned onto a quieter street lined with small shops and dim windows, her footsteps steady, her presence unnoticed among strangers who passed her without a second glance. And yet that anonymity did not diminish anything. It completed it, because she had never needed recognition to define what she carried. And as she paused briefly outside a small cafe, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk, she glanced inside, people laughing, talking, living their ordinary moments. And for a second, a faint smile touched her expression, not from nostalgia, but from something deeper, something settled, as if she understood something most people spend years chasing. That fulfillment does not come from being seen. It comes from knowing who you are even when no one is looking. And back at the theater, the judge who had spoken her name earlier now sat alone. For a moment, his notes untouched, his thoughts elsewhere, because in all his years of evaluating talent, of deciding worth in minutes, he had just encountered something that refused to fit into that system. And it forced a question he could not ignore. How many others had he overlooked? How many had walked away before ever being heard? And as that thought settled in, it carried with it a quiet shift, not dramatic, not immediate, but real, because sometimes the greatest impact is not in the applause. It is in what changes afterward. And as the night continued, one truth moved quietly through every conversation, every reflection, every moment of silence, that what they had witnessed was not just a performance. It was a reminder that the world often mistakes quiet for weakness, simplicity for lack, and age for irrelevance, until someone like Evelyn Carter steps forward and proves, without raising her voice, That true greatness has never needed to announce itself. It only needs one moment to be recognized. And once it is, it can never be unseen. The question did not fade. It followed them home. It echoed in conversations that stretched long past midnight. And by morning it had already begun to spread beyond the walls of that theater. Clips circulating online, headlines forming, names resurfacing that had not been spoken in years. And suddenly Evelyn Carter was no longer just a memory buried in archived performances. She was present again, not through interviews or announcements, but through a single moment that refused to be ignored. And inside the production office, the energy had shifted into something more focused, more calculated. Producers gathered around screens replaying her performance frame by frame, not for entertainment, but for understanding, for confirmation, for something they could build upon, because now they realized they had not just captured a performance. They had captured a story, one far more powerful than anything they had planned. And one of them spoke quietly, almost cautiously. If she comes back, this changes everything. But another shook his head slightly. People like her do not come back for that. And the room fell silent, because deep down they knew it was true. While across town, in a modest apartment filled with soft morning light, Evelyn sat near a window with a cup of coffee resting untouched beside her, the city waking up around her in familiar rhythms. And on a small table nearby lay an old program booklet, its edges worn, its pages filled with names and dates from another time, another life that she had never truly left, only stepped away from. And her gaze lingered on it briefly before shifting to the window, where the world outside continued without pause, without expectation, and there was something peaceful in that, something steady, because for her, the absence of noise had never meant the absence of purpose. It had meant clarity. And yet, even in that quiet space, the echo of the previous night remained, not as excitement, not as regret, but as a gentle reminder that some moments return not to change who you are, but to reveal it to others. And back at the theater, the judge who had spoken her name sat reviewing the footage again, this time not as a critic, but as a student, noticing details he had missed before, the control in her breathing, the restraint in her delivery, the confidence that did not need to be proven. And he leaned back slowly, a realization settling in that carried both admiration and humility, because what he had witnessed was not something he could measure, not something he could rank. It existed beyond that. And as the video ended, he whispered to himself, almost as a confession, we were never meant to judge her. And that understanding, quiet and undeniable, marked a shift that would not easily fade. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons are not spoken, they are experienced. And once experienced, they reshape everything that comes after. By the afternoon, the moment had transformed into something far beyond a single performance. It had become a story people felt compelled to revisit, to analyze, to understand. And across screens large and small, Evelyn Carter's voice echoed again, each replay revealing details that had been missed the first time, subtle control, intentional pauses, the kind of mastery that only becomes clearer the more it is observed. And commentators who had never heard her name before now spoke about her with a tone of discovery, while those who remembered her spoke with something closer to reverence, because they knew this was not a comeback, it was a reminder. And inside the production office, plans began to shift quietly, segments rearranged, conversations reframed, because the show could no longer pretend this was just another contestant. This was now the moment everything would be measured against. And yet one question remained unanswered. Where was she now? And more importantly, would she return? While in her apartment, Evelyn moved through her day with the same quiet rhythm, placing a record onto an old player, the soft crackle filling the room before a familiar melody began. One she had once performed on stages far larger than the one from the night before, and she listened, not with longing, but with understanding, as if recognizing a version of herself that had simply lived a different chapter. And when the song ended, she did not rush to replace it. She allowed the silence to settle, because silence, for her, had always been part of the music. And across town, the judge sat in a meeting that no longer felt routine, producers asking questions, executives suggesting possibilities, but his attention drifted, because what he had witnessed had shifted something deeper than professional. Interest, it had challenged the very way he saw talent, the way he measured it, the way he decided who was worth listening to, and he finally spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that redirected the room. If she comes back, we do not treat her like a contestant. And the words carried weight, because they were not about favoritism, they were about recognition, about understanding that some people do not fit into categories designed for others. And outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the conversations unfolding within it, unaware that a quiet woman walking its streets had just changed the perspective of an entire room. And as the day moved forward, one truth continued to take shape, not in headlines, not in ratings, but in the way people thought about what they had seen, that greatness does not need to return to prove itself. It only needs to appear once to remind the world it never left. The momentum did not slow. It evolved, shifting from curiosity into something more deliberate, more focused. As invitations began to form quietly behind closed doors, producers reaching out through every channel they could find, not with contracts or promises, but with a simple request for her to return, for her to stand on that stage again, this time not as an unknown name, but as someone they now understood they had underestimated. And yet, the more they tried to reach her, the more they realized how little they actually knew. No agent, no public contact, no digital presence that matched the world they operated in, and that absence only deepened the intrigue, because in an industry built on visibility, she existed outside of it entirely. While across town, Evelyn sat by her window once more, the afternoon light softer now, stretching across the floor in quiet patterns, a letter resting unopened beside her, its envelope marked with the show's insignia, delivered without ceremony, without urgency, just placed into her world as if it belonged there. And for a long moment she did not reach for it, because she already understood what it contained, not the exact words, but the intention behind them, the invitation, the opportunity, the attempt to bring her back into a space she had long ago stepped away from. And as she finally picked it up, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper, there was no excitement, no hesitation, just a calm awareness of what the decision would mean, not for them, but for her. And in the theater, the judge who had spoken her name stood alone on the empty stage after the audience had gone, the seats now silent, the lights dimmed, and for the first time he saw the space differently, not as a platform for evaluation, but as a place where something real had briefly appeared, something that had not needed validation. And he spoke quietly into the empty room, not expecting an answer. "We were not ready for you." And the words lingered in the stillness, because they were not just about her. They were about everyone who had ever been dismissed before being understood. And as evening settled over the city, Evelyn finally opened the letter, her eyes moving across the page with steady focus, reading the carefully chosen words, the respectful tone, the recognition that had arrived too late to change the past, but perhaps not too late to shape the future. And when she reached the end, she folded it neatly, placing it back on the table beside her, not discarded, not accepted, simply acknowledged, because for her, the question had never been whether she could return, it had always been whether she needed to. And as the room grew quieter and the last light of day faded into evening, one truth remained clear: some doors do not close because they cannot be opened again. They close because the person on the other side has already found everything they were meant to discover beyond them. The night settled gently over the city, and in the quiet of her apartment, Evelyn Carter remained seated by the window, the unopened world outside now replaced by a stillness that felt complete. The letter resting beside her no longer demanding attention, because its meaning had already been understood. The moment it arrived, and for a while she simply sat there, listening not to music, not to applause, but to the absence of both, a silence she had come to value more than any standing ovation. And yet within that silence, something subtle shifted, not pressure, not expectation, but reflection, as her gaze drifted once more to the old program booklet on the table, its pages worn from time, filled with names that had once defined her life, stages she had stood on, audiences that had filled entire halls. And she reached for it slowly, opening to a page where her name appeared in bold print, younger, brighter, part of a world that had once demanded everything from her. And for a brief moment, memory returned not as longing, but as understanding, the discipline, the repetition, the endless pursuit of perfection, all of it leading to something that had never truly been about recognition, but about expression. And she closed the booklet gently, placing it back down with the same care. Because she knew now what she had not fully understood then. That fulfillment does not come from being seen by everyone, but from being true to something within yourself. And across the city, the theater remained active, though quieter now. Conversations still unfolding in offices and empty hallways, producers waiting for a response that had not yet come. And the judge who had stood on that stage earlier now sat reviewing the letter that had been sent to her, his expression thoughtful, because he understood something the others were only beginning to realize, that this was not a negotiation, it was an invitation that might never be accepted, and that possibility carried a different kind of weight, one that forced them to reconsider what they were truly asking for, not another performance, but another moment of truth. And as that realization settled, it reshaped their approach, their tone, their expectations, because some opportunities are not about exposure, they are about respect. And outside, the city lights flickered softly as Evelyn finally stood, moving toward the window one last time, her reflection faint against the glass, a woman unchanged by what had happened, not elevated, not diminished, simply revealed. And as she looked out at the quiet streets below, one thought settled clearly within her, not spoken, not dramatic, but certain, that returning to the stage would not change who she was. It would only change how others saw her. And that distinction mattered more than anything they could offer. And in that understanding, there was no urgency, no need to decide immediately, only a quiet confidence that whatever choice she made would not be about proving anything to anyone, but about honoring something far more important. The truth she had carried long before anyone thought to listen. Morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet beginning that does not demand decisions but simply allows them to form. And in the soft light of her apartment, Evelyn Carter stood by the window once more, the letter still resting where she had left it, untouched but not ignored, because its presence alone had already done what it needed to do. It had asked a question, not of her talent, not of her past, but of her purpose. And for a long moment she remained still, her reflection faint in the glass, a woman who had already lived through applause, through recognition, through the rise and the silence that followed, and who now stood in a place far removed from both, not lost, not forgotten, but grounded in something far more enduring. And as she finally reached for the letter again, there was no hesitation in her movement, only clarity, not about what they wanted, but about what she had always chosen for herself. And she opened it once more, her eyes moving across the words, not to reconsider them, but to acknowledge them fully, before folding it carefully and setting it aside. Not as a rejection, not as acceptance, but as something complete, because the answer had never been written in that letter, it had always been within her. And across the city, the theater continued to wait, not just for her response, but for the possibility that she might return, that she might step once again into the spotlight they had only just realized she had outgrown. And the judge who had spoken her name sat quietly in his office, no longer reviewing footage, no longer analyzing technique, but simply remembering the moment the room had gone silent, the moment everything he thought he understood had shifted, and he did not expect her to come back, not because she could not, but because he now understood that people like her do not move in response to expectations, they move in alignment with something deeper, and that understanding, quiet and humbling, stayed with him. While in her apartment, Evelyn turned away from the window, her steps light, her posture unchanged. And as she moved through the room, the world outside continued as it always had, unaware of the choice that had just been made, a choice not announced, not shared, but lived. And though the stage remained behind her, and the invitation unanswered in the way others might have hoped, nothing had been lost, because what mattered had already happened, not the applause, not the recognition, but the reminder that dignity does not come from being seen. It comes from knowing your worth even when others fail to see it. And that day, without stepping onto any stage, without saying a single word, Evelyn Carter made a decision that carried more weight than any performance. She chose to remain exactly where she had always been, not hidden, not absent, but complete, and somewhere in the quiet space between memory and understanding, The world was left with something far more lasting than a show, a simple truth that did not need to be spoken aloud. That respect is never demanded, it is revealed, and once revealed, it changes the way we see everything that comes after.